So for today's movie review, I'll be reviewing the 1964 movie Godzilla vs. Mothra, or Mothra vs. Godzilla as it was originally called in Japan, or if you want the American version, it was called Godzilla vs. the Thing, in which had the most misleading advertising, in which when you looked at the posters, featured Godzilla either fighting against this giant question mark or like this weird plant octopus thing. And essentially the Americans did this to hide the identity of Godzilla's new opponent, since Godzilla was gaining some traction at that point in time, but apparently if you did see the trailers of the movie, you would have known it was Mothra in the first place. But anywho, it was also one of two Godzilla movies to be released within the same year, the other movie being Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, and this is the only time in the Godzilla franchise in which two Godzilla films were released in this exact same year, and it hasn't been done since then. But anywho, I bet you're wondering, how did the idea for this movie even come about? Well, with King Kong vs. Godzilla proving to be a box office success, Toho actually wanted to make a sequel to King Kong vs. Godzilla simply called King Kong vs. Godzilla Continuation. However, the project didn't make it past the proposal stage, and from there, Toho decided that they wanted to make another crossover film. But this time, Toho wanted to use one of their own monsters that they had from their own library. So Toho decided to pit the King of the Monsters against the Queen of the Monsters, Mothra, since she was a fan favorite. And I bet you're wondering, why choose Mothra out of all their monsters within their own library? Well, out of the non-Godzilla movies that Toho made, Mothra wasn't only liked by critics and fans, but the film also did so well at the box office that it made more money than the first two Godzilla films put together. So naturally when the movie came out, that's when Godzilla forever left his mark on cinema history. I'll talk more in depth about this aspect of Godzilla's film career later, but in regards to Godzilla vs. Mothra itself, the movie has since then not only become a fan favorite of the franchise, but it's also considered to be one of the best films within the Godzilla franchise. Which leads into my big question, is Godzilla vs. Mothra really that good? As for the plot of the movie, a giant egg suddenly appears after a hurricane. Soon afterwards, a greedy businessman decides to exploit the egg for money by turning it into a tourist attraction. Soon after, Godzilla suddenly appears going on a rampage, heading towards the direction of the giant egg. While Godzilla goes on his rampage, a group of humans and two small fairies call upon an elderly Mothra to head to Japan in order to save both her egg in Japan from the clutches of Godzilla. Now, in terms of what I liked about the movie, honestly, both cuts of the movie, regardless of what version you watch, are pretty good and pretty consistent. Sure, there are some scenes that are exclusive to one version of the movie as opposed to the other one, but I'll go into that sometime later. But in terms of what I thought was good about the movie, regardless of what version of the movie you watch, the movie has overall good production values from the costume designs for both Godzilla and the humans. The Mothra puppets are really good. The set design from the Pagoda Temple to some of the city miniatures are well detailed as per usual. The soundtrack is really good, and this time around, the music used in both cuts of the movie is done by Akira Ifukube. You can't go wrong there, especially with the Americanized version, because if you remember the past two Americanized versions of Godzilla Raids Again along with King Kong vs. Godzilla, they replaced the soundtrack with various stock music from various B movies and old westerns, but with the American version, they did the smart thing and just kept the natural soundtrack made by Akira Ifukube. I also thought that the movie had some good pacing from one scene to another. I never felt that the pacing to the movie was too fast or too slow. It felt just about right. Even the flow from one edit to another felt natural until the last 15 minutes of the movie, but I'll get to that later. And the movie does take itself seriously, because when you really look at the overall concept that this movie brings, it's about a giant radioactive dinosaur battling a giant moth. The idea sounds just as outlandish as King Kong vs. Godzilla, but with this movie, I think that concept works because Mothra was already giant size, so having this matchup made more sense. And on top of that, out of the sequels so far, this one is probably the most serious. Maybe not as serious as something like the original 54 movie, but in my opinion, I think it's more serious than something like Godzilla Raids Again or King Kong vs. Godzilla. Granted, King Kong Kong vs. Godzilla was meant to be more of a comedy, unless if you watch the American cut. But still, totally, this movie is a huge improvement in comparison to the previous two entries. And there's one scene that I want to talk about in particular that was, in a sense, a happy accident. That being the part where you see Godzilla battling the Japanese forces, and at one point, his head gets lit on fire, which provides for a cool visual. And I wanted to talk about this particular sequence for one reason, that being the suit actor Haruo Nakajima, if I pronounce his name right, is essentially the guy who played Godzilla from the original 1954 movie up until Godzilla vs. Hedorah, where he retired from a role, and he played many other monsters in between like Rodan and Mogera. But why I wanted to bring up the combination of this scene along with that suit actor, when the actual Godzilla costume got caught on fire, and sure enough, he was completely fine, and from what I've heard, apparently even when he did work on various other projects like Varid, apparently he broke some ribs, went to the hospital without telling anybody, got fixed up, came back the next day and just continued filming. That just shows how dedicated Haruo Nakajima was to the craft. He was completely and utterly unaware of the fact that the suit itself actually was on fire for a little bit. And in a way, the movie is very much like King Kong vs. Godzilla, where you do have this greedy person who tries to capitalize on the newer monster introduced for the film, while you have a group of characters who go to some tropical island to recruit the new monster to have the monster fight against Godzilla. But like I said earlier, the matchup between Godzilla and Mothra makes a lot more sense and sounds a lot more serious than something like King Kong vs. Godzilla, where the idea behind that one, like I said, is really absurd considering who was fighting who and how they had to handle said fight. Whereas with Godzilla vs. Mothra, that matchup made much more sense in terms of how they executed it. Also, this is the first Godzilla film to introduce human villains, because with the first three installments, Godzilla was the main villain, and really that's all you needed. Sure, you had Godzilla Raids Again, which had the 5-minute subplot revolved around the police officers chasing down some escaped convicts, but again, it's a 5-minute subplot that really did need to happen. But with this movie, on the other hand, by adding the addition of these greedy businessmen, it makes the human subplot more interesting. Now, sure, the previous installment also had a greedy businessman of sorts, but here's the difference. With that particular character, because of how greedy it was, he actually contributed to the overall plot of that particular installment by having the two main characters, by going to Faroe Island to capture Kong, and by doing so, Kong fights Godzilla and wins in the end. So in a weird way, he was kind of secretly the hero of that movie. Yet in this movie, basically it's the exact opposite of that, where here's these two dudes, and instead of trying to contribute to the overall story, they basically cause more problems for both the main cast of characters along with the people who worship Mothra. Also, the two greedy businessmen also tie into one of the two themes of the movie. The first and primary one being how human greed can infect the environment, because when you really look at how this movie presents that idea, we have these two people who buy this giant egg and decide to put it on display, trying to make money off it, which affects the balance on not only Infant Island, but they also had to drain one part of the ocean, and they unintentionally awakened Godzilla, causing problems for everybody. And as for the second theme of the movie, I could sum it up with the last few bits of dialogue from the main characters as they're saying goodbye to both the fairies and the Mothra larvae. The female photographer goes, "I wanted to thank the fairies and Mothra." But then you have one of the main characters who says this most poignant line in the entire film: "We will thank them by creating a world without distrust." Now, why do I bring this up? Well, if you've ever seen the original Mothra movie, the recurring themes that Ishiro Honda uses in most of his films, specifically for Mothra, was on top of having an anti-nuclear weapon message, he also had a theme of unity among the people of the world. And to some extent, I do think that his message of unity continues in this, because we have the cast of main characters trying to gain the trust of the Infant Island natives and to helping each other out to defeat Godzilla. And in the American cut, we have a scene which features the Japanese military working with the US Navy, and then we proceed to see the US Navy firing missiles at Godzilla. But this was never featured in the Japanese version because Toho thought that the idea of having a group of foreigners within the film, especially Americans, firing missiles on Japanese soil might not have been the most appropriate thing to show to Japanese audiences at the time. And before I go any further, remember how I said that Toho originally originally wanted to make a Frankenstein versus Godzilla movie, but were offered the rights to King Kong and they decided to use King Kong instead of Frankenstein to fight Godzilla. And I said that this was a smart move on their behalf. I could say the same thing about this particular movie as well. And the reason that I'm comparing both King Kong vs. Godzilla and Godzilla vs. Mothra, they both are not only similar in plot structure, but they also are similar in regards to what impact they leave on the franchise. Because with King Kong vs. Godzilla, that's the movie that introduced the entire world to Godzilla. And with Godzilla vs. Mothra, this is the film that not only perfected the monster versus monster formula, but it's also the movie that sustained the franchise. Like, it's the reason why we have so many sequels. So, in short, if it wasn't for the popularity of both King Kong and Mothra, Godzilla would never be as popular as he is today. Then you have the composite shots in the movie, which is both a good and bad aspect about the film, because on one hand, the composite shots here are a huge improvement over the composite shots that were seen in King Kong vs. Godzilla, because on one hand, a lot of those composite shots were really ambitious, but 75% of those composite shots are terrible, whereas most of the composite shots in this movie are really, really good and are a huge improvement over those composite shots seen in King Kong vs. Godzilla. And really the only bad thing about the composite shots in this movie are really the composite shots focused on Godzilla going on a rampage in the background, because you have the people in the foreground, which are real, the buildings in the midground, which are also real, but then you have the points in time where you have Godzilla, who is essentially behind the buildings going on a rampage. And it's at this point in time in which the effect doesn't look good at all, because it almost looks like Godzilla's not really there to a point where he almost looks like a giant walking ghost. In terms of what I disliked about the movie, before I actually go into what I didn't like about the movie, I'm going to bring up a nitpick first, that being the English dub for Godzilla vs. Mothra, or in this case Godzilla vs. The Thing, for two reasons. The first reason being that the dub itself is a very mixed bag, because on one hand, the dubbing for the main cast of characters I think sound really good, whereas the dubbing for some of the other characters, like the villains to some of the minor characters, I think sounds really terrible. Because with the dubbed cast of the main group of characters, at least when you hear them talking, they at least took the source material seriously, whereas the characters who did the dubbed voices for the villains and some of the minor characters treat the movie like it's a cartoon, even though the movie has a very serious tone. The second nitpick I had with the English dub of the film is the fact that within the context of the movie, they constantly refer to Mothra as the Thing. Now granted, yes, I am well aware that the advertising to the movie was called Godzilla vs. The Thing because the American distributors wanted to hide the identity of Godzilla's opponent, but when Mothra does show up for the first time within the movie, the two fairies refer to Mothra as Mothra at first, and then from that point onward, they constantly refer to Mothra as the Thing. And it's not just the fairies, it's all the humans are like, the Thing, the great thing. And this is just really annoying. It's kind of like watching the Americanized version of Godzilla Raids Again, in which they called Godzilla Gigantus. It's kind of like that. Now, in terms of what I actually disliked about this movie, the parts in which you have the composite shots with Godzilla going on a rampage in the background don't really hold up, as I said earlier. And Godzilla in this film is really clumsy. And I can name two examples. The first one being when you actually see him in the city. At one point in time, his tail gets caught in like this nearby Tokyo tower or a structure like it, and he has a hard time trying to pull his tail out, and when he does, the tower falls on top of him. And of course, the second example of him being clumsy is pretty much the point in time in which you see him fall on top of the pagoda, and apparently the suit actor actually had a hard time seeing through the Godzilla suit itself, which is probably the main reason as to why you have some of these points in time in which Godzilla is being clumsy. Another problem I had with the movie occurs during the last third of the movie, in which you see Godzilla battling the Japanese military, and it's at this point in time in which the lighting is inconsistent. And I'm not so much talking about the technical lighting. I'm more talking about the overall light that occurs within the actual story. Because when Godzilla starts battling the Japanese military, it takes place during the day. Then it cuts to the battle taking place at night. Then it goes back to Godzilla battling the Japanese military during the day. Because with the way the movie treats the last third, it treats the last third as the battle between Godzilla battling the adult Mothra, the Japanese military, along with the Mothra larvae, all occurs within one day. Yet when we have the two fairies singing to the egg and intersplicing that with Godzilla battling the military, it provides for this weird contrast in which when we do see the fairies singing to the egg, clearly it takes place during the day, yet there's some points in time when we cut back to Godzilla battling the military, in which starts out taking place during the day, but then takes place at night. So, in short, inconsistent lighting during the last third of the movie. Within the context of the story, I also felt that the last 15 minutes of the movie dragged out a bit too much in some aspects, because after Godzilla defeats the military, he heads towards this island, and then you have one of the minor characters realizing that a group of teachers and students are still on the island, and he's worried about their safety, and which forces the main group of characters to go towards the island as Godzilla is battling the two Mothra larvae. And why I have a problem with these last 15 minutes of the movie, it feels tacked on because the movie all of a sudden introduces a last minute plot device, that being this group of teachers and students, and makes the movie feel longer than it should because of this last minute addition. And I know that it is just a group of innocent children and teachers trying to survive on this island while Godzilla's going on a rampage, but we really don't get that emotional connection to them. Like, if I had to make this plot point more relevant, I feel like what they should have done was maybe sometime during like the second act of the movie, have the villain sit there and go, you know what, before I show this giant egg to the public, I shall show my son and daughter, along with their friends and teachers, this giant egg as a sneak peek before the opening, and maybe have the villain survive while trying to run away with this huge stack of money. And as he's trying to sit there and find his family along with all their friends, he comes to the realization that maybe his son and daughter along with the classmates and teachers are still on the island, and maybe the villain goes through some type of redemption arc and comes to his senses. I feel like if they did this, it would have made the last minute addition of this plot point of having the main cast of characters saving the teachers and students more relevant to the story and add more of an emotional weight to the movie. And speaking of the ending, this has to be one of the more embarrassing defeats for Godzilla when you think about it, because earlier in the film, we see him fight against the adult form of Mothra. Sure, she's old and has the upper hand on Godzilla, but Godzilla ends up winning that battle in the long run. Then he fights against the Japanese military, and no surprise, he wins against the Japanese military, yet he loses to two freaking larvae. And I don't know what's more embarrassing, having Godzilla battling these two larvae in the first place, or losing to the larvae. It's just kind of like, really? This is gonna be the final battle? Godzilla battling two larvae? Also, I do question one scene in terms of the character's peripheral vision, because when the fairies introduce themselves to the main cast of characters, they're like, the egg belongs to Mothra. They're like, Mothra. And then, they're talking a bit, then the two fairies are like, Mothra is nearby. And then they turn around, and sure enough, Mothra is right there in the distance. And I'm sitting there going, how the hell did Mothra end up there in the first place without them noticing? Was Mothra a ninja or something, just snuck up on them? Or was she there to begin with, didn't make a sound, and just had the characters not see her for no apparent reason? Because when you sit down and think about it, there's a giant moth sitting on a hill, and nobody notices it until the two little fairies point her out? Like, am I the only one that finds this detail weird? Or is Mothra secretly a ninja? So, for my final verdict of Godzilla vs. Mothra, or Mothra vs. Godzilla, if I had to make a comparison for this movie to me is kind of like King Kong vs. Godzilla, in that regard of, it's not my favorite installment of the franchise, but I definitely respect the movie for what it did for both the Godzilla character and franchise in the long run. But here's where the two movies differ. With King Kong vs. Godzilla, I thought that movie was just okay, but can be enjoyed in a so bad it's good type viewing. Whereas with Godzilla vs. Mothra, on the other hand, I do think it is a legitimately good movie, because unlike the previous two installments, which were really prototypey, it feels like Toho this time around finally managed to make a good follow-up to the original 1954 movie with Godzilla vs. Mothra. So overall, like I said, it's not my favorite installment, but it is definitely a good installment of the Godzilla franchise. And before I give my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about Godzilla vs. Mothra? And it looks like the movie got really average to good reception. And so for my final rating of Godzilla vs. Mothra, I give it a 3.5 out of 5. So between King Kong and Mothra, which giant monster do you think made Godzilla as popular as he is today? And see you later.